All right, we're all set.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. He's the person behind this communication and who is making possible that we all coordinate with everybody here right now. My name is Alex Borucki. I'm the director of the UCI Latin American Studies Center. And here today, we are with Professors David Witt and Professor Sabrina Smith to talk about 1520, the year 1520, and its significance for the slave trade to the Americas. People, perhaps one of the most surprising aspects of the 1619 commemorations that we have seen in the past year, and we have seen this fall with the Humanities Center emphasis on the Black Atlantic and on the 1619 project, is that few people realize that the earliest known slave voyages to sail directly from Africa to the Americas actually landed in Puerto Rico 500 years ago, in November 1520, indeed. To discuss these connections between Spanish colonization of the Americas and the development of the transatlantic slave trade, here we are today with Professor David Witt, who teaches history at Michigan State University and whose book, entitled Atlantic Africa and the Spanish Caribbean, won the Rawley Prize of the American Historical Association, as well as the Harriet Tubman Book Prize of the Lapidus Center. Professor Witt has also published several articles and 2 edited volumes on the history of the slave trade to the Spanish Americas and on the whole history of the 16th century Spanish Caribbean in the larger Atlantic world. We are also with Professor Sabrina Smith, who teaches history at University of California Merced. She published the chapter Slave Trading in Antequera and the Interregional Slave Traffic in New Spain, 1680-1710, in the edited volume From the Galleons to the Highlands, Slave Trade Routes in the Spanish Americas, and the biography entitled Juana Ramirez, 18th century Oaxaca, New Spain, Mexico, in the book As If She Were Free, a collective biography of women and emancipation in the Americas, who just got out. Congratulations on that, Sabrina. Well, let's start now with Professor Witt. How did the traffic of captives from the coast of Africa to the Iberian Peninsula shape the early slave voyages to the Americas?
That's a great question, Alex, and thank you very much, first of all, for having us here, and it's a real pleasure, and thank you so much for setting this all up. I appreciate it. That's a great question about this. One of the things that I think is very much overlooked in the study of the transatlantic slave trade, these earlier precedents on Iberia, between Iberia and Africa, and sort of continuities from those earlier precedents. So first of all, there was slavery in Iberia, right? Everyone, I mean, scholars generally know this, that in what's today Spain and Portugal, there was the slavery of African peoples of various origins, long preceding the European discovery of the Americas. But this, and, you know, with slaving routes, right, that already existed. And so there hasn't been, I think, an effort to trace continuities, right, but from this earlier period to what came afterwards. There's been more interest in, you know, other related topics, but not so much in actual transfer of slave routes. So I think a pre-existing trade that Antonio de Almeida Mendez has written some about, one excellent article, and also in his dissertation, you're looking at thousands of enslaved sub-Saharan Africans and people from the Sahel and West Africa who were taken from Arguin, this slaving factory essentially on a little island off the coast of modern-day Mauritania, who were taken from there to Portugal. And so we see, for example, right, this is one of the, major routes that enslaved Africans could be taken from different regions of Africa to, medieval Iberia, that we see, that we'll see a few cases of sort of a continuity after that. So this, the existence of slavery, slave trafficking of various types, and to see that a little bit replicated in the early transatlantic slave trade. Another thing I would mention is the early trade from Arguin, which I can talk a little bit more about in one of the other questions perhaps, or later on. This early trade from Arguin was basically under the control of Muslim merchants, right? So you had a little castle where first Portuguese or Iberians and later other European groups would stay. But in the late 1400s and even the very early 1500s, they would be going onshore to trade with people who probably were Muslim merchants tapping into trans-Saharan slaving networks, right? So you had very early on, beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, you had this, complicated system that doesn't fit very well with our models for the transatlantic slave trade. And I think it's much closer to what we see in sort of Western Mediterranean slave trafficking to Europeans invading, on these cabalgadas, so these like little trips on shore to ransom, to capture people and then ransom them back, like to capture, say, Amazigh people or Berbers and ransom them for enslaved, Black Africans, right? This sort of thing. So there's this complicated world that, we see sort of being pushed over into the very beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade a little bit. I mean, it fades, I think, pretty quickly, but there's a really neat period of transition that I'm pretty fascinated by.
Great, thank you. Going into the specific of the 1520 voyage and that information that you and Mark Eigel found, do you think there are more similar direct voyages between Africa and the Americas at that time, perhaps even before, and what's the stage of that research?
Yeah, that's another fun, I could talk a lot about this. Let's see, so yes, I think there are. I am particularly indebted to Mark Eigel, who has been working on this with me for some time now, ever since we got an ACLS collaborative research grant back in 2015-16. So we spent about a year at that time going to 10 different archives, mostly in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. And we found a lot of information. One of the things that we found was that records for Puerto Rico, the shipping records, or rather taxes paid on vessels arriving in Puerto Rico, go back about 5 years earlier than the records for Hispaniola. So I suspect, so if you look, for example, at the wonderful transcriptions that Genaro Rodriguez Morel recently published, is in the process of publishing, which had already been useful for us. They start in 1525, right? That's when the Hispaniola records, the extant records, as far as I know, that's when they start. So I think there were obviously earlier records, presumably, right, that are now no longer extant. So the ones for Puerto Rico start in the, I think before 1510, right? Really even before there was a strong European presence on the island. So in the 15 teens, right? And really starting in 1520 is when we first started to find these voyages, because the sources are better for Puerto Rico. I would also point out this evidence, we didn't even find it in that part of the Archive of the Indies. We found it in a different section, just by luck, essentially. So I would guess that there are more voyages. We know that this one was associated with what's often called an early asiento, sort of a contract, the Gordevod asiento, as it's often called. So it was very international with, in a European sense. It was the Spanish crown awarded a contract to Gordevod, who there's some debate about where he's originally from, but he subtracted his contract. He subcontracted out to this Genoese company and their associate, a Spanish guy from Burgos, who got permission from the Portuguese crown to go to Arguin. So you have this complicated network, and they were allowed to transport something like 4,000, a little over 4,000 enslaved Africans in this, 1815, 19, and in the following few years. Manolo Fernandez Chavez and Rafa Perez Garcia have a really, really good article that explains this aspects of this network and sort of what happened to it. It wasn't very successful. They ended up drawing more on enslaved people from Sao Tome than from Arguin. But I suspect that there's more evidence of other voyages during this period. I should probably stop right there, but there's a lot of material. People aren't really looking for slaving voyages in the 1510s, right? People aren't looking for transatlantic slave ships in the 1510s or 1520s. So a lot of what Mark Eagle and I have been able to do is by going through secondary sources, Puerto Rico Negro, right, by Jalil Sued Vadillo and Angel Lopez Cantos, right? There's fantastic material in there for the 1520s in Puerto Rico. So there is secondary scholarship that we need to continue to read and draw from and follow up the leads. But there's also a lot of archival work that that I think could still be done, even in Seville for sure, among other places.
Great. That points to additional collaboration indeed. And finally, on your side, what would you think is the most important feature about these slave voyages to the Americas in the 16th century, in the 1500s, that is largely unknown for the public? The thing that you say, this should be a main feature that it's very little known right now.
There's a few different ways I could take this. I would just say two things very, hopefully very succinctly. First of all, one of the ways that Mark and I have been looking at the 16th century slave trade to the Americas is there's different sort of paths to the slave trade, different ways of thinking about the slave trade and slave ships. So we our tendency as historians, right, who look at this sort of thing is to take better known periods or periods that we know more about and to project that backwards. One thing that we found is really different is about the 16th century, especially earlier on. In addition to sort of registered legal voyages, that there's an extensive paper trail of in Iberian, not necessarily in judicial records, but in sort of getting permission for these voyages and such. There's also a lot of so-called emergency landings that Mark has written about, actually, and other people have written about also for the late 16th and early 17th century. There's a lot of sort of arribadas or emergency unauthorized. We often call it just contraband, but a lot of them were later authorized after the fact, like, oh, you pay, slap on the wrist, shame on you, it's okay, right? But another avenue that we've been looking at is what's often called the Indies fleets, so regular passenger ships and merchant ships, which were far more numerous than specialized slaving voyages. This much more huge numbers of ships that were across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving from Seville primarily, sometimes stopping in the Canary Islands. They often brought enslaved Africans, or people of African descent, but some of them are described as bozales, like it's described as, quote unquote bozales, like unacculturated Africans who didn't speak Spanish or Portuguese yet, right? With the caveat that there's a lot of bias, right, in the term bozales that I don't want to replicate. But so Seville was serving as a place that exported enslaved Africans to the Americas in the 16th century, and people of African descent. So some of those vessels carried, you've probably seen me present this image elsewhere, the ships listed in the Shawnoo's Seville in the Atlantic. A lot of those ships carried, even ones that aren't listed as slaving voyages, they carried, 2 or 5 or 10 or 35 enslaved people aboard. That's another, I think, useful way to analyze the slave trade. There's these different ways of thinking about slavery and the slave trade. And so related to that, the other thing I would say about the 16th century, there's both continuity and sort of evolution of ways of slave trafficking. So people could think about the 16th century Atlantic slave trade in the same way that they've thought of the origins of the plantation complex, right? The origins of Atlantic slavery, right? That sort of thing. people could think about the slave trade in the same way. We could look at these older Mediterranean ransom, enslaving, and Christians trading with Muslims, those older practices on the one hand, and then we can look at what's happening in Sao Tome beginning in the very early 1520s also, with these larger number of enslaved Africans being brought out from this society that was already, creolized in a sense. Something it looks very different already by 1520. And so I think it could be an interesting component of these sort of broader debates about where some of the worst aspects of the modern world originated. There's a lot more to do there, I think.
Thank you, great. And that's for all of you who are in the audience who teach colonial Latin American, who teach the fleet system, to point that, look, in that fleet, every year there were slave Africans coming, indeed. Thank you very much, David. We're gonna proceed now with Professor Sabrina Smith, and we're gonna turn to Mexico, indeed. Professor Smith, how this early traffic through the Caribbean connects with the traffic of captives in the beginnings of colonial Mexico?
Okay, yes. Well, first, thank you for the invitation to speak today, and to Professor Boruqui's question. I think I'll start with thinking about the beginnings of Mexico, right, with the second half of your question. And when we think about the beginnings of Mexico or the conquest of Mexico, we know that Hernan Cortés, left Cuba in 1519 with his troops. He set sail for Mexico, for the mainland. And many of those troops would include Black sailors, soldiers, explorers. And these were people who were free or enslaved, right? And so I want us to think about this in terms of the fact that African descended people would play an important part of the conquest, right, of the military invasion, and colonization. And there are a couple people who come to mind who are prominent in this kind of history. Most of us know about Juan Garrido or Gaspar Yanga, right? And Juan Garrido was an African-born slave. He was a conquistador. He participated in the founding of the city of Veracruz. I think he went on and accompanied Cortés in the military invasion of Tenochtitlan in 1519. And then he went on to participate in the conquest of Michoacan. So when we're thinking about the very beginnings, right, like African descended people were already a part of this. So if we move on to think about the colonization, well, African captives would also play a critical role in the founding of Spanish colonial cities, the development and quite literally the building up of these cities. They toiled on the sugar plantations. They worked in the silver mining camps. And so this is all to say that they were very much a part of the urban and rural settings in Mexico, right? So how does this connect with traffic from the Caribbean? Well, in part, we have to think about the demand, the rise of that demand, and that comes from the decline of Mexico's native population, which prompts this need for a new workforce, right? And this stems from, the combination of the spread of disease, overexhaustion of the indigenous population, and of course, military deaths because of the invasion, which all would lead to the decline of a population of about 90% for the indigenous population. So we see that we have this one factor that's contributing to this rise of a slave labor, right? And then also the fact that the Spanish crown saw that the plantation complex was sort of already starting in the Caribbean, right? And based off of that precedent, right, the Spanish crown would allow for African slave labor to meet this demand for labor in Mexico. So on the one hand, folks like Juan Garrido, who accompanied their slaveholders into Mexico, that would form one way in which African passengers would enter the colony, right? And I think David Wheat was kind of pointing to this too, but most Africans actually arrived on slave ships, right? And these were individuals who had endured both transatlantic and Caribbean routes before even arriving on the shores of Mexico. And so when thinking about the shores of Mexico, the port of Veracruz is kind of critical here. Before 1700, it would, I believe it was the second largest slaving port next to Cartagena in the Americas. And so it received slave ships that came from, transatlantic, but also came through the Caribbean, from Jamaica, from Cuba, from Hispaniola. I think it's a historian, Joseph Clark, who has estimated that between 1519 and 1700, about 155,000 captives arrived through the port of Veracruz. So there is a sense of a direct connection there, right? And then the peak of traffic to Mexico would take place roughly between 1595 and 1640. And 1640 is such an interesting date in the history of Mexico because of the separation of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. So that after 1640, we see a sharp decline in slave traffic into Mexico. But there's still a demand there, right? Even though it's smaller. And that demand is then met through what's often described as contraband traffic, but also through the British, Dutch, and French slave trading, right? And so on that note, I'm so glad that Professor Wheat already described and defined an asiento. It took a little bit of the labor out of my answer, but the asiento that took place under Grillo and Lomelin, right, was a contract to import 3,000 to 4,000 Africans annually into the Spanish colonies, right? And it turns out that these merchants, and this is in the 1660s, that these merchants turned to the Dutch and British markets in Curacao, Jamaica, and Barbados to be able to bring slaves into Mexico. And I actually have documents who describe enslaved people who were sold and resold numerous times, but they originally entered into the colony through and under the Grillo and Lomelin asiento, right? And so this connection between the Caribbean and the slave trade in Mexico might be best described as overlapping circuits of trade, right? And Alejandro Lapuentes talked about this with Havana, that there's the transatlantic, the intercolonial, the coastal traffic. I would even add the interregional traffic, right? That's inland as well. And these circuits of trade, they could be interdependent, right? Meaning that transatlantic traffic affects the intercolonial traffic that comes from the Caribbean to the mainland and then onward inland too, right? But I think that these circuits of trade could also be independent, right? And simultaneously interdependent and independent, meaning that transatlantic traffic shifts throughout the year based on seasons. Meanwhile, circum-Caribbean or coastal traffic might be a little bit more constant throughout the year, so that we might see a greater number of slave ships coming in, or at least enslaved people coming on vessels through the Caribbean as opposed to through transatlantic traffic, right? And an example of that might be thinking about the relationship between Havana and the port of Veracruz. I mean, if logistically, these ports aren't that far from each other, right? And in fact, it might take about 3 weeks to sail from Havana to Veracruz. And that's literally the same amount of time that it takes to travel overland to central Mexico, right? So in terms of connecting it with overland movement into Mexico, Pablo Sierra has found like 3 roads, right? 3 main routes. And they all start in Nueva Veracruz, and they all seem to circumvent the Sierra Madre Mountains to make it into central Mexico. Perhaps a map would be really great right now. But one map travels north, right, through Jalapa. Another one travels south through Puebla, which might explain in part why there's such a large number of Angolan captives in the city of Puebla in the early period, right? And then the third route seems to be a hybrid kind of slave route, but it's a little bit more reliable, yet still longer than the other route. So I think this kind of shows us that the slave traffic within the Caribbean still shapes and affects what's happening in Mexico too.
Oh, well, great. Thank you. And you already talk about this internal traffic, but this goes straight to your own work, to your current work as you do research on Oaxaca, south from Mexico City. How will you describe the regional differences on the slave trade in 17th century Mexico from your own research of Oaxaca, but also from others?
Yeah. That's a great question. And there are some differences. There are some similarities. There are many differences, actually, when we think about interregional traffic to central Mexico versus that of a place that's further away, like Oaxaca. And I can start with central Mexico because I was just, speaking on that. That the sort of areas in which African slaves labored and toiled were somewhat similar in the sense that there were sugar plantations, craft shops, right? Domestic service. But in the case of central Mexico, the textile industry ends up being one of the key areas in which we find the demand for slave labor, right? And that doesn't really happen in Oaxaca. And then in addition to that, we might add the fact that I had previously mentioned that, the connection between Puebla and Veracruz was very close, relatively speaking, right? So that proximity to the port of Veracruz would mean that there would be large numbers of African captives in central Mexico that you might not find, or African-born captives that you might not find in Oaxaca, right? And specifically, I'm thinking about how Pablo Sierra has reported upwards of like 20,000 Angolan slaves that appear in the Caja de Negros, the slave registry, even before the 1650s. But again, that's tied to the relationship with Veracruz. So to think about American-born slaves, because I want to speak on that too, right? Most of the American-born slaves in central Mexico might come from urban and rural areas broadly in central Mexico, and then to a lesser extent, they come from southern Mexico and even Guatemala, which points more to my work, right? So for Oaxaca, and I'm thinking of the provincial capital of Antequera specifically, the enslaved population comes from sort of all over the place, from West and West Central Africa, East Africa, the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, Europe, right? So we start to see how the further we're getting from these Atlantic ports, right, and Pacific ports, things start to get a little bit more fuzzy, right? A little more complicated. There aren't very clear patterns. And in fact, after 1650, we often consider that as the irregular slave trading period, right? So one of the main differences has to do with the fact that the peak of imports to central Mexico takes place earlier than what we see further south in Oaxaca. And this is based on a couple of different factors, right? One having to do with the fact that in Antequera, the overall population, not just the slave population, was actually quite small up through the 1650s and 1660s, right? So there wasn't necessarily that large and overwhelming demand that we find in central Mexico. And then add to that African-born captives, and American-born captives came from many different areas, right? So between 1580 and 1640, the enslaved population was either African-born or American-born. Most were Black, and men were more frequently sold than women. And if there were African captives, they tended to come from, for the most part, Puebla, right? So again, kind of connecting back with central Mexico. But by the 1680s, much of this shifts. And so the piece that I published actually in the Galleons of the Highlands speaks on the 1680s to the 1730s. And during that period, African-born captives were often labeled as coming from Congo or Angola, right? And these are broad regions based off of the port of embarkation. So we did contextualize it within that factor. And they tended to come in through the colony, through the port of Veracruz, and then were transported overland to Oaxaca. So I have a pretty good example of this, if I can speak on that. In 1681, a slaving merchant by the name of Juan Martin Camuñas purchased 53 captives at the port of Veracruz, right? And so Camuñas and the 53 captives journey overland all the way to Oaxaca, which surely had taken several weeks. And once in Oaxaca, Camuñas starts selling some of these slaves in the marketplace. And he ends up only selling about 9 of the 53 captives. And most of the people who purchased those first 9 individuals were clerics, Spanish elites, and colonial officials, which those are overlapping categories as well. But within a couple of months, someone else starts to take over the slave sales. And another individual sells the remaining 44 captives, and that's a man by the name of Juan Ruiz de la Madrid. And so Madrid ends up selling the captives to traders, to landowners in Puebla, to sugar plantation owners. And so we see that there's a shift here in that perhaps the demand for slave labor in Antequera wasn't so great in Antequera as it was for Puebla or broadly central Mexico, right, in the 1680s. But on the other hand, there was clearly a need for slave labor in the sugar plantations, the sugar mills, the haciendas that were located in the outskirts of the city, right? So perhaps that ties in with the types of labor that enslaved people performed in Antequera in the tail end of the 17th century. And so what's clear, though, is that the rest of the buyers, right, the purchasers, ended up being wealthy Oaxacan merchants. They were, elite families in Antequera. And so at the local level, it's these individuals who are facilitating not just the transatlantic, obviously, but the interregional and intercolonial traffic within the colony. So it ends up being that, on the one hand, at the transatlantic level, we have Portuguese and British slave traders, but then at the more local level, it's low level and high level merchants, religious officials, colonial authorities and such. And then in terms of the American-born captives, these were individuals who hailed from, at times, Mexico City, because Mexico City had such a diverse slave population, right? Potentially Puebla, and most certainly Guatemala. And I think Guatemala is a really interesting part of this discussion because it makes us rethink the relationship of a place like Oaxaca is not necessarily only connected to central Mexico, meaning Mexico City, rather connected to Guatemala as well, right? And that these captives were then trafficked along the same commercial routes that were used to move goods like indigo and cacao, right? And so these transactions at that level were then more one-time or person-to-person transactions, as opposed to the movement of dozens of enslaved people.
Great, thank you. You mentioned many places in Mexico, many regions, and also you mentioned the Pacific at some point as a place of disembarkation for enslaved Africans. And we know that colonial Mexico received captive Africans, but also captive Asians from Asia, from the Pacific. Could you tell us more about that branch of this traffic?
Yes, another great question. And so I hadn't mentioned this as clearly before, but yes, Alex, as you brought up, African and Asian captives entered Mexico through the port of Acapulco on the Pacific side. And so we need to think about, when we think about the global movement of Africans, there's also the Trans-Pacific component. And the Trans-Pacific trade lasted from about the 1560s to the early 1700s. And included the arrival of about 8,000 individuals into Mexico and Peru. So much smaller by comparison, right, to the Atlantic component. And yet we still had goods and people who were moved through what's called the Manila Galleon, right? And that was between the Philippines and Mexico. So I think it's a really great comparison for the transatlantic trade. And similarly to the transatlantic trade, there was the asiento system, right? Which would eventually merge and turn into more of a monopoly system. And this involved the movement of enslaved people from a number of different areas, right? So we have slaves who came from the Spanish Philippines, from East Africa, from Portuguese India, even Muslim sultanates from Southeast Asia. And these individuals would come in through the port of Acapulco. And so these individuals upon arrival were often categorized as Blacks or Chinos, right? And Chinos was this general term, derogatory term used for people who came from the Pacific. And then those individuals were then resold and transported to other parts of the colony. For the most part, they went to Mexico City, but they were also, sent to other regions like the silver mining camps in the north, or even further south to Oaxaca too. But on the one hand, it's really hard to trace and to give a sense of the exact number of this population, because historical records don't often provide these kinds of categories, right, or classifications to identify these individuals as such, right, other than notarial records that come from Mexico. And so it's kind of obvious that the Manila galleon was much smaller than the Trans-Pacific slave trade, right? And yet, it was still a part of the traffic of enslaved people. And I think that it was smaller for a number of different reasons, right? On the one hand, ships sailed annually under the Manila galleon because the journey might take up to 6 months to go from the Philippines to Mexico. So, you know, one round trip was literally a year. And on the way to Mexico, these ships would carry goods like Chinese silks, Indian cotton, porcelain, spices, and then of course enslaved people too, right? And then we have to think about the harsh conditions that occurred aboard the ship, the incredibly high mortality rates, shipwrecks that also took place. But after months at sea, these ships would often land off of the coast of California, and then they would make their way south, right, and stop in Acapulco, then eventually down closer to Peru in Lima. So these voyages transported obviously goods and people in many cases as a form of contraband trade, right? So that's where it's difficult to determine the exact number of ships, right? I think that Diana has estimated something like 140 ships that moved across the Pacific between 1565 and 1700. And then the other part of this is the cost, right? So licenses were needed to bring enslaved people into Mexico. And then in order to journey on in Mexico, you needed an additional license. So all of this could be quite costly. And yet the profit was also undeniable. For example, if a slave was purchased in Manila in like the 1630s, for instance, they might be sold for 37 pesos in the Manila marketplace. And if that's same individual was then resold in a place like Acapulco in Mexico, they might sell for over 200 pesos. So there is clear difference in in prices and potential for profit, right? And so where did these individuals go once they arrived in the colony? Well, most of them took what's called the China Road, which went directly from Acapulco to Mexico City. That's a distance of about 600 kilometers, so it's quite far. Others might go to Puebla, and then again, some came to Oaxaca. And I can talk briefly about one case study that I have, and it's of a Black slave named Antonio. And so Antonio appears in a notarial record from Antequera, from Oaxaca, in 1703. And he's described as a Mozambican captive who was transported through the Indian Ocean trade routes all the way to Manila, right? Where he stopped and how long he stayed in each particular place is not clear just yet. But once in Manila, Antonio was then enslaved to a cleric in the 1690s. So I started to basically trace this individual backwards, right? And that cleric then resold Antonio to a merchant who was also a resident of Manila. And that merchant then traveled along with Antonio across the Pacific in 1700, right? So once Antonio and his slaveholder arrive in Acapulco, they're basically sustained by someone else, by another individual, because the slaveholder doesn't even have any money. And it turns out that Antonio's slaveholder ends up owing this other individual 350 pesos to cover the cost of food and housing that they've been provided over the course of several weeks of staying in Acapulco, right? So the slaveholder is completely out of money, and he ends up trading Antonio to clear his debt of 350 pesos. And so basically he says, well, you know, you can sell him off elsewhere and you'll make an even greater profit, right? And so this anecdote basically shows us that during this era of the irregular slave trade, right, both on the Trans-Pacific and transatlantic sides, these transactions were very much irregular, where you might have a transaction between one individual and another, or it might be something a little bit more systematic in terms of the movement of dozens of captives, or you might have a situation where enslaved people are used as collateral for other contracts or larger transactions too.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Smith.
I think you're still muted, Alex.
Oh, really? Now I'm speaking? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Smith. We're gonna now deal with some of the questions of the to the panelists that we have been receiving through the Q&A window. If you want to do some questions, you can write down those questions in the Q&A window. And there are some questions specifically regarding to the life and treatment of those enslaved people, both in the 16th century, but also that's from Kevin Cronin, but also down the list from Sheila Walker regarding Africans and people of African ancestry in the Pacific coast of Central America. I will assume that will go to you, Sabrina, over there. So if you want to reply on those things.
Sure, I can jump ahead, and I'm just, it turns out it was my sound that was off. So I can address, I'm skimming through the questions here. Maybe I'll work backwards from Sheila Walker's question. Cultural continuities from East Africa to Pacific Americas. That's a very broad region or number of regions that we're talking about, right? So it wouldn't be clear to necessarily say that you can find some kind of continuity between, let's say, East Africa. Even the Mozambican captive, Antonio, is described as coming from Mozambique, but the period of the 1680s, early 1700s, that might mean a broader region of East Africa that may or may not coincide with contemporary boundaries of Mozambique, right? And just off of the small number of documents that I have describing his journeys, it's not even clear how long he spent either traveling between East Africa and the Philippines, or if he made, I haven't been able to figure this out just yet, whether he made stops in South Asia, because it sounds like that might have been likely, right? And so if we're talking about, to go back to the question of continuities, we also need to consider the multiple levels of ruptures and fragility that these individuals are facing, right? And in the sense that they're resold a number of different times, sometimes twice, 3, 4, 5, 6 different times. And they're also living within many different contexts as well.
Thank you. And Professor Witt, if you want to talk about a little bit about the early life, the life of enslaved Africans in this very early traffic of your period, which is the early 1600s, the early 1500s, sorry.
Oh yeah, that's a big question. There's I see in a different question they refer to the Tannenbaum, the Tannenbaum debate, which focuses on the 19th century really, which compares the treatment of enslaved people in what's today the United States, essentially, to people in Catholic countries. Back in the 40s, 30s, when he wrote this, it was sort of the Anglos versus the Latins, I think, was how people in the U.S. thought about this sort of thing. So he's focused on Cuba and Brazil, but like I said, it focused on the 19th century, and generated this huge debate. Some people are sick of it. I still think it's kind of interesting and would like to see it expanded to earlier periods in some ways. But the treatment of enslaved people in the 16th and 17th centuries it really varies widely. It depends on where they were, where they had to go, basically, right? So you had people working in mines, you had people working on plantations. You also had, people who were working as sailors or carpenters' assistants, or building ships or other things. You had people preparing food. You had people doing pretty much any musicians, any type of labor you can imagine. So it's really hard to generalize, I guess, for me, about the treatment of enslaved. A lot depends on who was the person who claimed ownership of them, and how they, on really an individual level, because slavery was, in the 16th century anyway, being an enslaved person in the Iberian world was seen as you were a dependent, you were right. I mean, this is eerily, creepily reminiscent of some of the things we hear from the 19th century, like antebellum U.S. South, sort of like part of the family, but that was the ideology, that somebody was a member of the household. Unlike, not to go off on a Tannenbaum tangent, but unlike what we see in other cases or in the antebellum U.S. South, enslaved people in the Spanish Americas anyway could write a letter or have a letter written on their behalf to the Spanish crown. And we have letters like this. I mean, some exist that, and not just enslaved Africans. People could have a letter written on their behalf or send a letter somehow, right, in theory, saying, I'm being mistreated, but people, and there's a whole literature, right, by historians who study Inquisition records and who show that enslaved people would blaspheme intentionally in order to get the Inquisition's attention, right, and then use that as a way to say, yeah, I was just messing around. What the real issue is, I'm being tortured at home, right, by my owner, right. So there's again, there's a lot of variety depending on their specific context, I would say. So I kind of dodged the question there. If that's.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I was going through the menu of the question, trying to honor the order in which the questions were doing. And going back to you, David, these questions also from Professor Alka Patel about wondering about the Muslim merchant actives in Arguin, and to what degree this Muslim category elucidate but also occludes other aspects of the whole network. Were there African Muslims or there were other Muslims? The region of origin would be important to bear in mind. What you can tell us something more about that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. That and it's at that issue is to me like the whole key of trying to figure out what's going on and who are the people who are trading with Europeans in the late 15th, early 16th century. Spanish sources will use the term, like some of the other terms that Sabrina and I mentioned earlier, some of these vague terms. The Spanish use the term moro, like Moor, to describe pretty much anybody in that area. Every now and then they'll use a term that we could roughly say berberisco, which we could translate roughly as Berber. But these are really general categories that don't tell us very much. In addition to regional identities, I think political identities would often also be really interesting to know who, what polity do these people belong to, right? Are these trans-Saharan traders who are, kind of moving back and forth, or are these, I mean, even African, right? We have to be careful what we mean by African. Are we talking about, Black people from farther south? It's not far from the Wolof territories that Jean Bouleg has written some cool stuff about for this period. But then you could also have people who we can gloss in English as North African, but that I think doesn't really do many favors to people either, right? These are very vague and broad terms. To do more on the Arguim side, and this is one reason I haven't been able to go as far with it as I'd like yet, is that, you really one would have to immerse oneself in 15th, 16th century Mauritania, Morocco. Yeah, so I've been working on it through sources from the Canary Islands. There's some really interesting activity, and the historiography of Morocco there's some really cool stuff for the 17th and 16th century. But yeah, the term Muslim is, I completely take the point that it obscures a lot more than it reveals. And I also don't want to imply that there's some sort of religious frontier that's like a sharp dividing line, because people are trading across those, ostensibly Christian and ostensibly Muslim territories all the time. And then, again, this is very old, going back to the Mediterranean patterns, or pre-Spain patterns in the Iberian Peninsula, right? When you have significant Muslim populations and Muslim polities, like under Muslim rule. Right? So there's a lot of interesting, more connections, to this earlier periods. to be drawn out of that. I think that's where that's how I would like to, the direction I would like to move with that eventually. I would like someone to move that.
Thank you. That's a really great move to do. I mean, in research terms, to go deeper in that direction. But moving from Western Africa to Western Mexico, and I'm doing the move as I have you on one side and Sabrina on the other. There are several questions on the menu, particularly related on Acapulco, on the diversity of Acapulco, and other people asking questions about the situation of people of African ancestry in Central America in your time in the 17th century. If you can talk a little bit more both on Acapulco and Mexico, but also Central America in particular.
Yes, and I see a number of great questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to try to address most of them as best I can. So one of the questions was who would have been involved, or what mechanisms would have been involved in the Trans-Pacific trade. Those are Portuguese merchants for the most part, right? And that also connects with the question about South Asia. There's Portuguese Goa. The Portuguese were highly involved in transatlantic, but also Trans-Pacific trade, not just of enslaved people, but overall goods as well, right? And then on the note of African descendant people on the Pacific coast versus the Atlantic side of Veracruz, and I'm trying to combine a number of questions here, connecting the past and the present. On the one hand, we have a number of studies that talk about the history of Blacks in Mexico, right, of Afro-Mexicans. And there seems to be the division in the historiography on folks who work on the colonial era and then folks who work on more contemporary topics that tend to be sociologists, anthropologists, and such, right, and political scientists. And for the most part, these two camps aren't really talking to each other. And then we have a very small number of studies like Ben Vinson's Before Mestizaje, which is, you know, one of the first attempts to break through the 19th century to say, well, hey, actually, our current conceptualizations of race in Mexico have some kind of connections back to the colonial era, right? And this is not completely disjointed from the past. And yet, on the other hand, contemporary studies seem to understand the Pacific side and the Pacific populations as being very different from those of Veracruz. And I'm talking about how people understand Blackness and origins of Blackness, right? So for the Pacific side, the descriptions have often been, oh, there was some sort of shipwreck narrative, and that's the reason why we have Blacks in that particular region, right? And that just doesn't happen in Mexico. That happens in many different places. However, we see through this transatlantic and trans-Pacific trade that, in fact, there was an earlier precedent there that would lead to slave labor used in sugar plantations, especially south of Oaxaca, if we think between present-day Oaxaca City and the coast. And so the largest concentration in the present day of Blacks in Mexico tends to be in the Costa Chica, which is along the states of Oaxaca and Guerrero, right? The understanding in Veracruz is that the Black population, or Blackness in general, is tied to proximity to Cuba, right? So to the rest of the Caribbean. So these are two very different narratives. And to point to Professor O'Toole's question, I'm going to try to take a stab at it, is that how folks are understanding or remembering the slave trade today, right, I think is critical, especially for the year 2020. I mean, this is the first time that the national census in Mexico will include Black racial classifications since basically 1792, so over 200 years ago. And preliminary census recordings, or intercensal data, I believe it's called, from 2015 has shown us that more people identify as being of African descent in Mexico than what's been previously understood, right? And so that this 2020 census is going to give us a better sense of the full picture of how many people throughout Mexico, not just in these pockets of the Pacific side and Veracruz, identify as having some kind of Black heritage. Along with that, we're seeing greater numbers of historical sites, right, to represent historical memory of the slave trade and or of Blackness in general, of the institution of slavery. And so I think that in some ways we're starting to see major change. And a part of this has to do with grassroots efforts from the 90s, right? This is not something that suddenly happened in the 2000s. But we're starting to see greater numbers of recognition, both of the sort of Black past that forms part of Mexico, right? And the Black present too.
Thank you very much. Going into that same direction, the question posed by Professor Rachel Toole to reflect on the 1619 project in the US, what times of reconciliation, and we may add memory also, have occurred or occurred in Mexico, Puerto Rico, and we may add Spain regarding Spanish participation in the transatlantic slave trade. We know very well, we know by we meaning historians of Spanish America, sometimes Spaniards blaming the Portuguese, like, oh no, it was the Portuguese who conducted the slave trade. Spanish slave trading only was in the 19th century, and it was just Cuba, and that's it, and was mostly people of the north, like Catalans. But outside that, okay. I don't know that much about what's going on in Puerto Rico. Perhaps some of you may answer that part of the question. And for you, Dave, particularly if you can answer the Spanish part of the questions, since from the panel, you are the one closest to Spain right now, right?
Yeah, I'm in Spain actually right now. I'll tell you this, the best scholarship for the periods I work on, the 16th to 17th century, on the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, is being written in Spanish. I mean, that's hands down. You have scholarship produced in Mexico, in Colombia, scholarship produced right here in Spain, and there's a lot of. I mean, I have a lot to read, man. I'm trying to keep up with a lot of stuff, but I think the transatlantic slave trade is not at the top of the list here, right? People are still, working on, again, there's regional differences, right? But people are still trying to figure out how to deal with the Spanish Civil War right now in the Canary Islands. Right now, there's, thousands of people migrating from Morocco and different parts of West Africa, and into Europe via the Canary Islands. So there's a huge crisis right now in the Canary Islands. So there's a lot of other things that think conquistadors, the part of Spain I'm in, there's these statues of conquistadors that get somebody's place, not me, I promise, who splashes red paint on them every year around Columbus Day, right? And there's the same year, there's this debate, they were, local heroes. No, they committed genocide, right? And so, there's all these sorts of public debates. I see, excellent scholarship being done on the transatlantic slave trade, but I don't see a lot of public debate about it, except perhaps some of the work that's being done for Catalonia, for like Barcelona. There's some cool, very cool scholarship over there. But looking at the 19th century, but for the 16th century involvement, there's not as much public effort to reconcile. And as far as I know, people trying to sort of link Spanish individuals' participation in the slave trade as sort of to current realities, right? As like a deliberate project, like the way we see for other periods in other places, So I'll put it on our to-do list, I guess. Or maybe it's not something that I'm keeping an eye out for as much as I probably should. There is the Casa de Africa in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria would be that would be a good place to ask people to see, because they would know a lot better than I would about contemporary. I mean, that's their thing, is to sort of reconcile what's happening in Spain with what's happening in different regions of Africa. Yeah.
Great. Sabrina, you may want to add.
Yes, and again, I'm not as familiar with what's going on in Puerto Rico, but in terms of reconciliation, I would, on the one hand, the 1619 project, my thoughts on it, it's something produced by journalists, right? So, or a body of journalists, right, through the New York Times, and that points to some of the major issues of writing history, right, when it's not a historian involved or behind it, directly behind the project. So that these questions of, well, what happened before 1619, especially in places like Puerto Rico or even, Spanish Florida, lead us to understand that in reality, this slave trade or this traffic of captives had happened long before, in fact, about a century before the year 1619. So yeah, I can't clearly understand or even talk about Puerto Rico specifically. But I think that I would imagine there have to be a lot of issues there with grappling with that, right, with the year 1619, and that technically representing the United States, which Puerto Rico, would eventually form a part of. I did want to tackle, if I have time, there was one question or a number of questions about Central America, which came up again. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about it. Central America is pretty interesting to me. And it was actually one of the reasons why I went in to study, Blacks in Latin America and in Mexico specifically. And it had to do with like my own heritage, right? As being of Central American descent. And so Central America, especially certain countries, have kind of denied Blackness, historically, right? In the contemporary context. And yet there's a long history there as well of people who inhabited parts of, I'm thinking of my work with like Santiago de Guatemala, for instance, right? There are also pockets on the Atlantic side of Honduras, of Garifuna in Guatemala and Honduras and Belize, even in Costa Rica, Panama, of course. As well. And so, I mean, there's certainly a longer history there of slavery, of the traffic of captives as well. And that actually kind of points to the second project that I'm working on too, right? Is thinking about, first of all, like what was the size of these populations throughout, these different areas of Central America. And there are a number of Spanish language studies already on this, but also what did the traffic and movement of these individuals look like between places like Southern Mexico, namely Oaxaca, and then points further south, all the way down to Lima, right? And I kind of came upon this question because I started to see a number of individuals who had been sold in Oaxaca coming from Guatemala, coming from as far south as San Salvador. So we're talking about El Salvador, right? But also a greater number of reports of enslaved people who were running away to these places, specifically to Guatemala, to Portobello, to Lima, and taking on completely new identities as free persons, right? And so there's something to be said about that connection or these commercial networks that are connecting Mexico with Peru. And I would love to, pursue that as the second project to start to think about what's going on there with these free and enslaved populations.
Great. I'm not a specialist on Puerto Rico either, but when I was talking with other historians or other scholars about this 1520 and this first known slave voyage direct from Africa to the Americas, the first question that they replied, why Puerto Rico? Like everyone would thought like, okay, Hispaniola or Cuba, but Puerto Rico, wow. And now that I make 2 más 2 son 4, 2 plus 2 is 4, that probably has been replied by David when he mentioned that the tax records from Puerto Rico are substantially older than from Hispaniola. And we really may think that there must be a number of slave voyages happening to Hispaniola in that time, in between 1520 and 1525. indeed, which may be connected to this. Regarding with the issue of reconciliation, it would be great to have a specialist on Puerto Rico on this to speak with more authority, indeed. Okay, well, David, you will want to tell us what is your current research and that you're doing there in Spain, since Sabrina told us a little bit of her second project that she's doing right now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's not on. I will keep an eye out though for evidence of effort to reconcile with the slaving past. If I learn of anything, it has not been on my radar, but I will keep an eye out. I'm not here for research. I'm here for pandemic reasons, teaching remotely, family type issues. But I'm hoping to get back to some archives pretty soon. I've been looking at what's happening in the Canaries during the 1560s lately, really as a way of 1550s and 1560s, as a way of trying to figure out what's happening in Sierra Leone. There seems to be like a small, relatively speaking, a small surge in the transatlantic slave trade to the Caribbean from Sierra Leone in the late 1550s, early 1560s. And historians of West Africa there's a source by a guy from Cape Verde Islands, pretty famous, who in the 1590s with this wonderful description of the entire coast of West Africa. And one of the things he talked about was in what's today Sierra Leone, there was an invasion, how one African group invaded and a lot of other people were forced to flee and ended up being enslaved and on European slave ships and such. So I've been trying to link those, use Spanish sources, notarial records in the Canaries to see if I can find out more about that. And it's been fun, but I need to go back pretty soon to to find out more. That's what I've been working on for lately, sort of 1560s.
We all need to go to Canary Islands soon, indeed.
It's a nice place. It's a nice place.
Okay, well, I think we can start wrapping up over here. I thank again Professor Sabrina Smith, Professor David Witt for joining us in this panel. And I also thank Ryan, who is behind the wheel, providing staff support for all this communication to happen and for us not to panic over an unmute microphone like I usually do. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.